This is a night for an Understanding the Times study, and so I think everybody has a packet or the papers, but if you don't, then there's a few more on the back table there. I saw this actually in the Daily Courier. We need to figure out how to explain to the kids what's going on in Ukraine, help them better understand the war. That's the lady. Husband says, okay, but first, can you help me better understand this war? So, and that's a good thought. I mean, it's hard to understand what happened there in terms of any common sense view of it anyways. It's a totally unnecessary war, but wars often are from human perspective. And so we're going to begin by looking, number one, the basics of the Russian war on Ukraine. Just kind of spend a couple of minutes looking at that and what's going on there. It started February 24th, as we probably remember, and so it's been a little over a month and a half, not quite at this point, and actually just a little over a month. And it's, like I said, it's a war. Oh, Kim, can you turn off the center panel of lights there? That center, that'll help. That helps, okay, good, thank you. This war, there's, like in most wars, or every war, there's at least two different parties. And this one, at this point, it was just one-on-one, but one is much larger and much more powerful than the other, and it's the one that is the aggressor nation, Russia, larger, more powerful, and aggressive against the Ukraine. They border one another, obviously. It's not like they're fighting across the seas or anything. Their borders touch. There's a world map, and that's Ukraine, that little thing right there. I looked it up. Ukraine, in terms of size, is smaller than the state of Texas. So it's got more people than Texas, but in terms of land size, it is smaller. And Russia is at least 1.5 times bigger than the entire United States, including Alaska. So it's a large nation versus a very small nation. And population-wise, they're not that bad off or separated, but still it's much larger. Russia is still much larger than Ukraine. I think I wrote the populations here down, but yeah, Russia has 144 million and Ukraine 43 million. So it's about 3 times size on that, but many times size larger in terms of the the land mass. It really started, and you can say this war started long time ago, but you can trace the current thing back to 2014 when Russia attacked, invaded, and then annexed, made a part of Russia and their own properties, Crimea. And when that happened, everybody condemned it, but nobody stopped it or undid it. It's still, Crimea is still part of Russia, at least controlled by Russia. They put their own people in charge of Crimea, politicians, leaders, and who are supportive of Russia. And that's what happened 8 years ago, almost to the day. It actually was started in February of 2014, so very close. I don't know if that means anything, the same month happening, but that's when it started. Crimea is that little kind of peninsula down there. So was part of Ukraine, but it's that little part there. And Russia's controlled it since 2014, but this map here shows the darker pink, solid pink, areas that Russia controls as of, it's about a week ago, I forgot the date on this. So it's maybe more or less than this now, but the pink slatted part is a place that Russia at that time was still fighting. They hadn't controlled it yet, but were making advances there. This was interesting to me and sad, obviously, that reports from anybody that you read reports from indicate that the Ukraine has suffered more civilian deaths than military deaths. So we've seen pictures of children, women, birthing center being bombed, that sort of thing. and more civilian deaths have died or have taken place in Ukraine than military deaths, people fighting. Here's a chart that indicates that. Again, this is through a few days ago, March 24th, different dates. Civilians, the Ukraine, they say over 4,000. UN says about 1,000. That one might be elevated, that one might be deflated, but Ukrainian forces, 2,000 to 4,000, so a few more people, civilians, than military have died. Russians, they say 500 have died. The United States says between 3 and 10,000. NATO says 7 to 15,000, and the BBC says 557. So you'll never know, which one of these numbers is the most accurate. My guess is the Russian number is not the most accurate out of that list, but 3,000 to 15,000 is the ballpark estimates by outside parties, the United States and NATO. So Russia, almost every number, I mean, except for their own lowball figure, every number, they've lost more military than Ukraine military have died, which is hard to imagine. I mean, a nation 3 times the size in terms of numbers, much more powerful in terms of the weaponry, and yet more of their people have died in the fighting than the Ukrainian military has died. When you add up the civilians to that, then it's more even, but more Russian military have died than Ukrainian military. One of the scariest part of this is the threat of nuclear war. I haven't heard President Putin say that he's going to send nuclear bombs against the Ukraine, but against anybody that interferes with their. He was thinking this can be over in a short time. He thought when he announced the war, we're going to attack. Anybody who interferes, nuclear war is possible. But he thought, I'm sure the attack on Ukraine would be over very quickly. And it hasn't gone as they expected it to do. And what that does, though, is make the threat of nuclear war more impossible. Even on Ukraine, it's more possible because right now he's losing. At least it's a draw at the best. And so it's a possibility of nuclear war from him. Our president said something he shouldn't have said a day or two ago, and everybody's kind of scratching, why did he say that? I'm talking about he needs to go. I forgot the exact wording, but President Putin needs to be replaced or something like that. And that kind of makes it worse, because now he's able to tell the Russian people, I told you those Americans are going to attack us, that sort of thing, and get me out of here. And so that was not helpful at all. And that might extend the war and make the war even worse. So far, point number 5, other nations have not taken up arms on either side. They've sent arms, military help, or other types of help to Ukraine, but there's no other nation who's got weapons fighting for the Ukraine, no other nations fighting for Russia at this point. But that's always a possibility. Both sides have their allies. Russia has China, especially. Ukraine has American other allies that could help them also. But it's right now just a local war, one nation against another, but there's a good possibility of it expanding to that. Always has been that possibility. And kind of the longer it lasts, it might get worse instead of better. It's always a possibility in this. So that's what's going on right now. And you can look at this kind of a list and say, well, those same things have happened other times. World War I started similar, one nation against another. World War II, many wars just start small, and sometimes they stay small, sometimes they last a long time, sometimes they last very briefly. Sometimes they escalate and include many other nations. And there's no way to know what the direction this one's going to be in a month or 6 months from now. Maybe over, or maybe much more severe. So with all of that said about the Russian war on Ukraine, we need to be praying, obviously, for that to settle down and to not escalate. No sane person wants war. And or will start wars even. I don't mean saying necessarily that they would flunk a sanity test, but it's not right thinking to start a war against some other nation. And of course, Brenda and I, we have two sons in the military, and we don't want war. They get trained, probably the best trained people in the world, but you hope they never have to use their training besides practice. And it wouldn't be pleasant to find out, our nation is involved in war, but it's always a possibility. So be praying for that war to end, hopefully not with a conquest, but just with a peace treaty between those two nations, stopping it. Okay, what does the Bible say about war? Wars in biblical history we're going to look at, and we're going to look later at wars in biblical prophecy. But what does the Bible say about warfare? And obviously, there's a lot of examples, especially the Old Testament, obviously, but many, many wars that take place during the Old Testament time, nation of Israel and other nations involved. One of the first references to war, not the first, but one of them, Israel had been enslaved by Egypt for 400 years. God raised up a deliverer named Moses. They got out of Egypt, came to the Red Sea, crossed the Red Sea. Pharaoh's army following after them was drowned in the sea. And then after they got to this place of safety, Israel's safe, Egypt's army is not a threat anymore, Moses wrote and sang a song. And in that song, he called the Lord a man of war. And it's an interesting title for God. We always like to think of God as a God of peace, God of comfort, things like that. But Israel needed him to be a man of war. They were a small army, small untrained army, not even really an army, a small nation, being hounded by the most powerful army in the world at that time, most powerful nation. They needed help, and God gave them that help. And Moses said that the Lord is a man of war, defending us and helping us in this battle. When I was turned to this, I'll read it, so if you don't wish to, I know you got hands full with papers there, but let it be another description of war, and I'm going to go to Exodus chapter 17. But the Lord authorized Israel to go to war with a nation called Amalek. And he authorized this because of their unprovoked attack. Israel didn't do anything to Amalek. They were just, Exodus 17 tells after the deliverance out of Egypt and the crossing the Red Sea. Exodus chapter 17, verse number 8, then came Amalek. God has been providing Israel, caring for Israel, giving them food, manna, water. Verse 8, then came Amalek and fought with Israel in Rephidim. Unprovoked, nothing that Israel had done to Amalek or the Amalekites. They just came to and attacked them. This is the war. Verse number 9, Moses said to Joshua, choose us out men, go out and fight with Amalek. Tomorrow I will stand on the top of the hill with the rod of God in my hand. And this is the war that Moses needed help having his arms held up. When his arms drooped, they were losing the war. When his arms were held up, then they were victorious and winning. And the end result, go down to verse number 12, Moses' hands were heavy. They took a stone and put it under him, and he sat thereon. And Aaron and Hur stayed up his hands, one on the one side, the other on the other, and his hands were steady till the going down of the sun. And Joshua discomfited Amalek and his people with the edge of the sword. He killed them, he defeated them. But that's not the end. Deuteronomy 25. And although it's several books later, it's not a long time later, Israel has not yet come into the promised land. Hard part about a brand new Bible, pages stick together. And right now, Deuteronomy 25, there it is. Verse 17 of Deuteronomy 25. Remember what Amalek did unto thee by the way, when you were come forth out of Egypt, how he met thee by the way, and smote the hindmost of thee, even all that were feeble behind thee, when thou wast faint and weary. The hindmost, the feeble, those are faint and weary. Again, that's not identical to what Russia's done to Ukraine, but again, all the civilian deaths, more than military deaths. That's what Amalek did. They snuck up behind them and they killed the older people, the children, those who were feeble, etc. Verse 19, therefore it shall be, when the Lord thy God hath given thee rest from all thine enemies round about, in the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee for an inheritance to possess it, that thou shalt blot out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven, thou shalt not forget it. And God assigned one man to carry that out. That was King Saul. And Saul says, sure, I can do that. Went to war against the Amalekites, and of course he didn't carry that out. He spared the king, he spared some of the flock, etc. He excused it, defended himself. It's the best of the flock, that sort of thing. We'll use it to sacrifice or whatever. And Saul lost the kingdom because of that. And Samuel took Saul's sword, or a sword anyways, and killed the king of Amalek because God said, I'm going to wipe them off, blot them out. So God is a man of war, and after an unprovoked attack, he said that nation that did that is going to suffer, and suffer completely in their case. Page 2. Still in the same time frame, before they went into the land of Canaan, Deuteronomy chapter 20, the Lord instructed Israel on two types of wars. One was the war of self-defense. Deuteronomy 20, verse 10. When thou comest nigh unto a city to fight against it, proclaim peace unto it. And it shall be, if it make thee answer of peace, and open unto thee, then it shall be that all the people that is found therein shall be tributaries unto thee, and they shall serve thee. If it will make no peace with thee, but will make war against thee, then thou shalt besiege it. So don't attack them. Let them, if they fight against you, then fight back. That's the description there. Another type of war, the next few verses, is wars of conquest. Verse 16. But of the cities of these people, which the Lord thy God doth give thee for an inheritance, thou shalt save nothing alive that breatheth, but thou shalt utterly destroy them. And then he gives the Hittites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, Jebusites, as the Lord thy God hath commanded thee, that they teach you not to do after all their abominations which they have done unto their gods, so should ye sin against the Lord your God. There are times God said, if they come against you, if they don't want to make peace with you, fight back. Others, he said, go to them and destroy them, defeat them, and don't let anything live from that. And from a human perspective, from a military perspective, that sounds very harsh. But God's reasoning, verse 18, that they teach you not to do after all their abominations. He was concerned about their spiritual lives and their souls. If you leave them alive, you're going to follow after their false gods and idolatry. And God said, kill them, get rid of that sinful behavior and temptation there. And Israel did fulfill that completely, unfortunately. They allowed some of them to stay alive. They didn't kill all of them. They made peace treaties with one, etc. But that's God's instruction. War of self-defense and war of conquest, going into the promised land. So at different times, and we will look at these passages, but sometimes in their history, Israel is the aggressor nation. God authorized that. Other times, they are the attacked party. Other nations, communities, cities, whatever it was, attacked Israel. And a lot of the Old Testament, historical parts of the Old Testament, you often see wars taking place. Israel, because the Bible's about primarily the nation of Israel in terms of human people, the wars are typically involving Israel. But there's other nations doing warfare, of course, at the same time. We just have the records primarily of the wars with the Israelites. Sometimes God used war to punish Israel. The Babylonians, 2 Chronicles 36, God directed the Babylonians to come against Israel and to defeat them, allow them to take captives, allowed them to kill people, allowed them to take possession of Jerusalem. That was because of the sins of Israel, and God was punishing them for that. So sometimes God is on the side of Israel, helping them. Sometimes God helps the adversary. That's the question of the book of Habakkuk. Why would you do that, God? But God has a purpose, and there's always a good spiritual purpose. It's hard to see that sometimes. Why would you kill? I didn't read the verses, but Deuteronomy 20, verse 14, verse 13 says, "Smite every male." Verse 14, "The women, and the little ones, cattle, all in the city, take unto thyself." So kill all the men, but don't let the women just run free and their kids grow up free. Take them all as captives. It sounds harsh. It sounds not the right way to conduct a war. But God always has a purpose, spiritually good purpose, protecting his own people primarily, and in some cases just being merciful. There's probably women and children as well as old people that were attacked by the Amalekites, and God's saying, don't do that to these ones here. Prayerful dependence upon God helped Israel in the time of war. 2 Chronicles 20, pretty much the entire chapter. This is the battle with Jehoshaphat was the king of Judah at the time. And he called upon the people to pray to God, seek God's help in this conflict. Start reading verse number 5, just a couple of verses here. "Jehoshaphat stood in the congregation of Judah and Jerusalem in the house of the Lord before the new court and said, O Lord God of our fathers, art not thou God in heaven? And rulest not thou over all the kingdoms of the heathen? And in thy hand is thy not power and might, so that none is able to withstand thee? Art not thou our God, who didst drive out the inhabitants of this land before thy people Israel, gavest it to the seed of Abraham thy friend forever?" And he goes on like that. You're our God, not their God. You helped us. You gave us this land. Now we're being attacked. Help us. And sometimes God didn't. He sometimes punished Israel. But this case and other cases, he did defend Israel miraculously many times. But their prayerful dependence upon God in time of war, they prayed to the Lord. I remember, and I wish I should have looked this up, but the day after Pearl Harbor, whenever President Roosevelt gave that speech to Congress, day that'll live in infamy, towards the end of that, he called upon Americans to pray, God be on our side, something to that effect. And we don't hear that anymore. It's like the politicians can't talk about praying to God to help America or help us. And I'm saying America is the best nation compared to, we're all sinners. Every person on the face of the earth, whatever nationality, we're all sinners. But whatever your country is, there's nothing wrong with praying for God to help and protect you and defend you. And once upon a time we did that. Read George Washington, things like that way back in the day. And like I said, in World War II as well. Not so much lately. I'll never forget, President Bush, when we got on 9/11, what should we do? He said to go out and buy stuff. Don't let the economy collapse. Like that's the most important thing. And far from the most important thing. Prayerful dependence upon God helped Israel. In terms of the New Testament, the references to war are pretty silent. There's a lot of references to spiritual warfare. There's references to war in prophecy. The book of Revelation refers to war several times. But other than that, the New Testament is silent. It doesn't describe, and this is important, it doesn't describe the Church of Jerusalem going to war. It doesn't describe the Church of Rome going to war. Nothing like that. Nation of Israel as a political, governmental institution, that's one thing. The church, totally different. God never said, you Christians, we sing songs, onward Christian soldiers, but that's not a physical war, going to fight against the pagans or whatever. There's no reference to war besides prophecies in the New Testament, military wars. Therefore, letter H, and this is important, it's kind of what I just said, neither the church as a whole nor churches individually are authorized to go to war, either to fight against others or, quote unquote, to convert others. 2 Corinthians 10 tells us that we have different battles and we use different weapons. Verses 3 and 4, though we walk in the flesh, we do not war after the flesh. The church, Christians, individually, if a person joins the military, that's totally different. But in terms of the church as a body going to war, we don't war after the flesh. We're not involved in military conquests. The weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty through God to the pulling down of strongholds, casting down imaginations, and every high thing that exalteth itself against the knowledge of God, and bringing into captivity every thought to the obedience of Christ. It's really, if anything, it's a war with ourselves that we're involved in, not a war against some other person or nation or religion. So we have different battles. We don't war after the flesh, and different weapons. They are mighty through God, not carnal weapons. Little subpoint here, the Catholic Church, they have a long history of doing the opposite of that. One thing to remember about the Catholic Church, a lot of what they believe and practice is not only based on the Old Testament, it's taken from the Old Testament. There's no king in the New Testament. There is a king in the Old Testament. Therefore, they have a pope, somebody over everything. There's no priesthood in the New Testament, besides every believer being a priest. There is a priesthood in the Old Testament. Therefore, the Catholic Church has a priesthood. They're a New Testament church, quote unquote, but they rely upon the Old Testament, the nation of Israel, a political body, nation, for a lot of what they do and believe and practice. Part of that, of course, were crusades and other things where they would march into nations and threaten at the point of a sword, convert or die, that type of thing. Luke 22:38. I almost laughed, although it's tragic, when I read how the Catholic Church interpreted this. Start at verse 35. This is Luke 22, towards the end of our Savior's life prior to his arrest and betrayal. He said unto them, when I sent you, said unto the disciples, when I sent you without purse and scrip and shoes, lacked ye anything? And they said, nothing. Then said he unto them, but now he that hath a purse, let him take it, and likewise his scrip. He that hath no sword, let him sell his garment and buy one. For I say unto you that this that is written must yet be accomplished in me. And he was reckoned among the transgressors, for the things concerning me have an end. And they said, Lord, behold, here are 2 swords. And he said unto them, it is enough. So Luke 22:38, we have 2 swords. And the Lord said, that's enough. The Catholic Church, in an amazing feat of interpretation, says one of those swords represents government, the other sword represents the church. That's how they define that. So the government has the sword, the government can go to war, but as well the church has a sword, and the church can go to war. And in their wars, they're typically to conquer lands, get more wealth, and get so-called converts to their cause. If you don't convert to us, we're going to kill you. And a lot of people, of course, converted under that threat. But the New Testament doesn't grant that. And to take a verse like that, which has nothing to do with what they're talking about, one sword's the church, one's government, is a foolish as well as an evil thing, and very destructive for countless numbers of people through history. first mention of war in the Bible is Genesis chapter 14. And you may recall that it involves Abraham. At the end of it anyways, Abraham goes and rescues Lot, his nephew. Verses 1 through 7 describe wars of conquest. A group of cities that combined together went against and conquered some others. Verse 1 mentions several kings that made war with, verse 2, several other kings. So war of conquests begins. This first mention of war is one group of people attacking another group of people. After that, verses 8 through 10, there was a war of self-defense. The party that was attacked the first time went out and joined battle and went to fight against the ones who had attacked them in the first place. So one nation, one group, it's not just a nation, it's several communities or cities mentioned, attacks a group. Time passes. Verse 5 refers to 14th year, so it's not like the next day or week or whatever. It's years and years pass. The other nation comes back and fights back, war of self-defense. Similar to what the Lord had authorized in Deuteronomy, or will later authorize. The victors in the war took goods and people. Food, things like that, they took. And as well, they captured people. Among the people, of course, was Lot. He's the most well-known out of them. But people were taken captive in this war, the second war. And that brought about a war to liberate the captives. Abraham getting his own army and going to fight and to rescue Lot and the others. And that description, you see the different kinds of wars. Conquering other people. There's authorized by God, authorizing Israel, but it's really not authorized absolutely in the Scriptures. War of self-defense. And that failed, but that war of self-defense, that seems to be authorized in the Scriptures. War of liberation. Finding people that have been taken wrongly and going to deliver them. That is a good purpose for war. They're not conquering something, not taking somebody's stuff. They're not taking somebody else's people. They're delivering people who are taken captive in a war. And it's after that that we have the first mention of peace in the Bible. Melchizedek, the king of Salem. Salem in reference to peace, or another word for peace. So you have war, but as well, the end of it, reference to king of Salem, king of peace. Here's all of that kind of builds up to this, the biblical theory of a just war. And you might look at that and say, how can a war ever be justified? And there's some who think it never can be. That's point letter A here. There are many Christians who are pacifistic, practice pacifism. Individuals, denominations. I mentioned last Sunday Sergeant York. He was pacifist until he went back, studied the Bible, and came back and said, okay, I can fight. I understand now. But pacifism is the belief that it's never right to participate in a war. War of conquest, war of self-defense, nothing. You can never go to war against somebody else. Here's a couple groups that are still like that. Mennonites and Quakers are today pacifists. And there's several biblical bases for that. First one is the sixth commandment, thou shalt not kill. And they look at that and say, well, and there was a big one in Sergeant York, because I remember the movie, but can't kill anybody, so how can I go to war? Because war is killing people. The New Testament, turn the other cheek. If they hit you on the right cheek, give them the other cheek as well. And they say, well, even if I'm attacked, I can't fight back because Jesus said to turn the other cheek. Love your enemies is another passage that's used to defend pacifism. The Bible doesn't say fight against your enemies or shoot your enemies or bomb your enemies. It says love them, pray for them, bless them, etc. And then later on, overcome evil with good. If somebody's done evil to you, do good to them. If a nation does evil to another nation, that attacked nation, Ukraine, going back to the war currently, should do good to Rome. That's how a pacifist, or not Rome, Russia, excuse me. That's how a pacifist would view this. So those are some, not all, but some of the main biblical defenses for pacifism. Something important, though, instructions for personal conduct. Thou shalt not kill. If somebody hits you, turn the other cheek. If somebody's done something, you love your enemy. Personal conduct are not necessarily guidelines for national conduct. Thou shalt not kill, but God gave governments the sword, the Old Testament. Man takes a life, by man shall his life be taken. The New Testament, Romans 13, he bears not the sword in vain. God has given to governments the authority to kill, to use a sword. You don't spank somebody with a sword or whatever. You use it as a weapon to kill people. So thou shalt not kill applies to individuals, doesn't apply to a nation. So pacifism sounds good, and like I said, nobody really wants war, but pacifism is a view that applies to the individual. I'm supposed to love my enemies, but it's not governance for a country. If one country did this, they'd be wiped out tomorrow, because the other countries aren't going to do that. And this is personal conduct, not national conduct. Warfare in early stage of world history was conducted without any rules. And like I said, we see this in the Bible quite a bit. Kill them all. The Amalekites, kill every single one of them. King's been captured, kill him. He's not supposed to live. And the other sides too, fighting against Israel, they just killed whoever was there. There wasn't no controls, no guidelines for it. There was no just war. People just killed and killed until there was a surrender or something. Even David and Goliath, he knocked Goliath out and went and cut his head off. Instead of capturing him or whatever else, he cut his head off. No rules. That war with David and Goliath, they did have a rule. Whoever wins between David and Goliath, the other nations surrender. That didn't happen. The Philistines ran away instead of surrendering. No rules in warfare. And all's fair in love and war. We still say that to this day. But a man named Augustine, you probably heard of him, he's sometimes called Saint Augustine, but a man named Augustine, way back in around 400 AD, developed a theory called the just war theory. And then another man, Thomas Aquinas, almost a millennium later, developed it a little bit more. And what a just war is, there's 3 requirements for a war to be done rightly. And you say, well, how do you do a war rightly? What's happening in Ukraine is not a just war, because it violates these things. If there weren't for these types of rules, you could say Russia can do whatever they want because there's no rules in war. A just war says, here's how wars, if they're going to be conducted, here's how they're supposed to be conducted. Number 1, must be waged by a government with legitimate authority, not private individuals or rebel groups within a nation. So for a just war to be a war, for a war to be a just war, it must be a government establishing it, authorizing it. Whatever the government system is. In our case, the Congress approves wars. In other cases, it's the king or whoever does it. But it has to be by a government, not individuals. There must be a just cause. War must be against an enemy who is at fault. You can't just say, I want their land, and say that's my reason for this war. That makes it an unjust war. I don't like that person, I'm going to kill that leader, whatever. That'd be an unjust war. There has to be, that First Nation had to have done something to require this response of war. One obvious example of this was World War II. We were attacked by Japan, we fought back. There was a cause. They attacked us, we responded against that attack. They were at fault, the response was such as it was. And even before that, Germany went into Poland, etc. For them to fight back was an appropriate thing. They fought back because the other nation was at fault. The third basis for a just war, there must be a good intention to advance good or to avoid evil. And it's not eeny, meeny, might pick one of these three. It's all three. It's got to be a government with a just cause and a good intention. Going back to Genesis 14, Abraham did that by himself. That was not a government action when he responded. But there was a good intention to liberate Lot and the others. A just war requires, today Abraham couldn't do that, to be in line with this just war theory. It has to be a government authority authorizing it. There has to be a reason for it. And Abraham had a good reason. They took my people, took Lot and others, and a good intention to liberate people. And those three guidelines will make a war just. Violating any one of those three will make it an unjust war. Again, to find that in the Bible, you're not going to find, a chapter and verse to say those three things. But applying Old Testament warfare and principles, and as well New Testament guidelines and standards, you come up with a government with a just cause and a good intention. Okay, wars in biblical prophecy. Biblical prophecy. The book of Revelation has several, but I want to begin in the book of Ezekiel, chapter 38, because Ezekiel describes a war that many believe includes Russia as one of the participants, in fact, as the aggressor nation. When I was a teenager, Jack Van Impe was very prominent back in those days, and he preached a sermon. I got it on a record, a long-playing album, and the title of it was The Coming War with Russia. And he preached that all over the country. He had it, like I said, as a record even to buy. And as I looked at that later, when I was a teenager, I said, wow, that's a great sermon. When I looked at it later, I was kind of skeptical. Somebody in the 1970s saying Russia's a bad nation is one thing, because they were a bad nation, the Soviet Union, the Russian bear, and all that sort of thing. We oftentimes look at the newspapers and then look for a verse in the Bible to say, hey, this is what's going on there. So I was skeptical as I went further. But looking at this description in Ezekiel 38, there is strong evidence to indicate that this is a reference to Russia and a war going to take place. Chapter 38, verse 8 tells us the timing of it. Let me go ahead and read the first couple of verses of chapter 38 first, and then go down to verse 8. Verse 1, and the word of the Lord came unto me, saying, Son of man, set thy face against Gog, the land of Magog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, and prophesy against him. And say, Thus saith the Lord God, Behold, I am against thee, O Gog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, and I will turn thee back, and put hooks into thy jaws, and I will bring thee forth and all thine army, horses and horsemen, all of them clothed with all sorts of armor, even a great company with bucklers and shields, all of them handling swords. Persia, Ethiopia, and Libya with them, all of them with shield and helmets. Gomer and all his bands, the house of Togarmah of the north quarters and all his bands, and many people with thee. Be thou prepared, and prepare for thyself, thou and all thy company that are assembled unto thee, and be thou a guard unto them. After many days thou shalt be visited. In the latter years thou shalt come into the land that is brought back from the sword, and is gathered out of many people, against the mountains of Israel, which have been always waste. But it is brought forth out of the nations, and they shall dwell safely, all of them. In the latter years. I looked that up, that phrase in the Bible. A lot of times in the Bible, not a lot, but a few times in the Bible, we see the phrase latter days or last days. This is the only place the Bible refers to in the latter years, that phrase there, that language. And the timing, if I were to guess, just fitting it in with other prophecies, during the 70th week of Daniel's prophecy. Israel's going to be attacked. God's going to defend and protect Israel. And the Bible describes things like that in the New Testament. The reference here in verse 2, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal. If you got a footnote Bible, mine does, my brand new Bible, has a little footnote. Prince of the chief. So not the chief prince, but the prince of the chief. That word chief is the Hebrew word Rosh, R-O-S-H. And when it's just, a lot of times it's translated by the word head or something like that. It's just, the head of a person, head of a country. Sometimes it has that meaning. But sometimes it is used in a sense that makes it look like it's talking about a group of people or a nation or something like that. So again, verse 2, Son of man, set thy face against Gog, the land of Magog, the prince of Russia, is how that would be translated. And then on top of that, of Meshech and Tubal, which again historically has been viewed by not everybody, but by many as a reference, Meshech being Moscow and Tubal being Tobolsk, both of them cities in Russia. This war is further described in chapter 39, here we go, forgot this. Here's some people that looked at this, again, 1871, not the 1970s, not when the Soviet Union was at its peak or anything like that. 1870, Russia was a big nation, but not a powerful world power threatening people all the time. Jameson Fawcett Brown commentary. The chief prince, rather the prince of Rosh or Ros, middle part there, the modern Russians may have hence assumed their name as Moscow and Tobolsk from Meshech and Tubal, though their proper ancient name was Slavai or Wens. So here's a legitimate commentary. I read this commentary all the time in my studies, but the word Rosh, prince, it doesn't say it is, but may have assumed their name, Russia, Moscow and Tobolsk as well. Another one from 1845. The Septuagint interpreters take the word Rosh, commonly translated chief, for a proper name. They render the sentence thus: the prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal. Rosh, taken as a proper name, signifies those inhabitants of Scythia from whence the Russians derive their name and origin. It should be not original. So this one states it not as a possibility like the first guy, but he's stating that's true in his understanding. It signifies inhabitants of Russia. And then the Hebrew lexicon or dictionary defines the word Rosh, not all the time, but in this chapter, these two chapters, the proper name of a northern nation supposed to be the Russians. So again, for somebody in the 1970s to look and say, Russia's a world power, we got to find something in the Bible that tells us about them. That's one thing. But for a century before that, people to be saying Russia in the latter years is going to be a world power that attacks Israel, To me, that lends a lot more credibility to it than somebody coming up with that idea 30, 40, 50 years ago. What they will do is come against Israel from the north parts. And world map, Russia is obviously north of Israel. Chapter 39 of Ezekiel, verse 2, I will turn thee back and leave but the sixth part of thee, and will cause thee to come up from the north parts, and will bring thee upon the mountains of Israel. And I will smite thy bow out of thy left hand, and will cause thine arrows to fall out of thy right hand. Just like God did often in the Old Testament, he's going to defend Israel in this attack. And if this isn't some future time, it hasn't happened. There's no account of a nation and this coalition of nations, Persia, Ethiopia, Libya, Gomer, etc., attacking Russia or Israel from the north. Either Ezekiel was wrong, speaking symbolically or something, or this war hasn't yet happened, which is more likely the case. At the end of the war, the Lord will exalt himself by defeating this army. And obviously, if it is Russia, you got Russia, Persia, which is Iran, of course, Ethiopia, Libya, Gomer, something that's reference to Ukraine, I understand. I think I've understood it to be Germany myself. Togarma mentioned it there. Some view that as Turkey. But whatever those nations are, 1 against 6, again, you got a large, just like the Russia-Ukraine thing right now, a large aggressor against a smaller nation. The larger one being aggressive against and attacking the smaller nation. In this case, though, God will defend Israel. I'll smite thy bow. Thou shalt fall upon the mountains of Israel, verse 4 says. I will give thee to the ravenous birds of every sort, to the beasts of the field to be devoured. Thou shalt fall upon the open field, for I have spoken it, saith the Lord God. I will send a fire on Magog, and among them that dwell carelessly in the isles, and they shall know that I am the Lord. God will defend Israel at this warfare, protecting his own people, but as well exalting himself. They will know that I am the Lord. And again, that hasn't happened yet. Gog and Magog is mentioned in the book of Revelation after the millennial kingdom. But it doesn't seem to be the same thing here. Revelation doesn't say they're attacking Israel from the north. They're attacking the Lord, Satan, etc. But this war here, if I understand right, something that happens before the 70th week begins, to me it fits better inside the 70th week. But whenever, it's still a future war. Other references to the war, biblical wars and prophecy, leading up to the Lord's return. Matthew 24 says there'll be wars and rumors of wars. And my understanding, again, I could be wrong, I know, but that would include the war mentioned by Ezekiel. There's wars and rumors of wars. War against Israel take place the time frame leading up to the Lord's return. Before the midpoint of the 70th week, though, the midpoint of the 70th week, Israel is in the wilderness, protected by the Lord completely. Satan's going to try to attack them, the Bible says, Revelation 12. God protects Israel. But this seems to be a different event than that, based on God's response to it. That word rumors of war, we use the word rumors in a different way. A false story. You're going to hear about a real war. It's not really happening. There's no real war, that type of thing. But the word just means something that is heard. And it's often translated by the word report in the New Testament. When Paul quotes Isaiah, who hath believed our report? That's the same exact word, who hath believed our rumor? Again, our use of the word rumor today is different than King James translating that. It's not a false story that there's no war taking place. You're going to be involved in wars, you're going to hear about other wars, you're going to hear reports of wars. That's what the Lord is saying. But he as well says in that same, Matthew, Mark, and Luke all quote the Lord on this. He says, these things must happen. There's a necessity to these wars taking place. And then he as well says, but the end is not yet. There are going to be wars leading up to the time prior to the Lord's return. And we're going to know about them. They're going to happen, but the Lord still will not have come yet. He comes after these wars taking place. So the Lord said, don't be troubled or terrified by them. Hey, let me read that. So just quoting that. Well, can't find it offhand right now. But in the same context, where the Lord said, don't be troubled in one passage, I think Mark, and don't be terrified in Luke. Don't be bothered by hearing about wars, is what the Lord is saying. Even during that 70th week, don't be bothered by wars taking place. Don't be worried. Don't be panicking. Don't be troubled or terrified. And it's natural to do so. We don't want to go to war. We don't want to be bombed, etc. Don't want our kids to go to war. But the Lord said, they are necessary events. Just trust the Lord. And if we trust the Lord, we're not going to be troubled by things. We're not going to be terrified by things. We're not going to read the newspaper and start to panic. That's not how Christians react to things going on in the world. We respond in faith and hope in the Lord instead. Final point, the biblical response to war in world conditions, in addition to not being troubled or terrified. First of all, we should pray for kings and all that are in authority. And it's always been interesting to me how Paul said kings plural. He doesn't say just pray for your own king and hope he does good, but pray for kings. Pray for our leaders of our nation. Pray for the leaders of other nations. Pray for the president of Russia. Pray for the president of Ukraine. Pray for the president of the United States. Here's why. 1 Timothy 2, verses 1 and 2. I exhort therefore that first of all supplications, prayers, intercessions, and giving of thanks be made for all men, for kings, for kings and for all that are in authority, that we may lead a quiet and peaceable life in all godliness and honesty. Pray for the political leaders of the other nations as well as our own, so that we as Christians can live a quiet life, a peaceable life, live a godly life. And again, if we shouldn't expect the government, I guess, to tell us to pray or ask us to pray. We should just do that instinctively because the Bible tells us that. But it'd be helpful if our nation would focus more on prayer. They have a day of prayer every year, but that's, I'm not sure the value of those necessarily if you just do it once a year. But pray for political leaders of the nations. Understand that wars will continue until the Lord returns again. Matthew 24. And that's a chapter, one of the 3 chapters that speaks of wars and rumors of wars. In response to the question, when shall these things be? What shall be the sign of thy coming and the end of the world? You'll hear of wars and rumors of wars. There it is, verse 6. See that you be not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. The end doesn't come in terms of the Lord's return, verse 29. And verse 30, then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. Until the Lord comes again, we're going to be hearing about and seeing reports of wars taking place all over different places of the world. Therefore, he says, don't be troubled. They're going to keep on taking place. Remember that this world will not end by a war among the nations. Remember back in the 60s, it said hippie movement and all that. Afraid of wars, afraid of nuclear war, and so they're carrying the signs, the end is near, that sort of thing. War is not going to end by Russia bombing the United States or the United States bombing Russia. That's not going to be the end of the world. The Bible tells us how the world is going to end. This picture, political cartoon, That's the earth blowing up. One guy's yelling to the other, I said, we sure settled that dispute, didn't we? And 1963, it won a Pulitzer Prize. That's not going to happen. The world is not going to end like that. It's not going to be war nation against nation. Those wars are going to happen. Nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. But that's not how the world's going to end. The Lord will judge this world during the day of the Lord. There'll be wars involved in that, Battle of Armageddon, etc. But the Lord will judge the world and then ultimately return and defeat all of those. Every unbeliever on earth is going to be put to death when the Lord returns. Revelation 19 tells us that. So that's how the world is going to end. Again, the disciples asked, what shall be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world? And he didn't say there's going to be wars going to end it all. He said there's going to be wars and rumors of wars, but I'm going to come again first and then defeat all the enemies. So the war's not going to end, the world's not going to end by nuclear war. Letter D, long for the day when the Prince of Peace rules upon the earth. At that time, there'll be the end of war among the nations. That Isaiah 2 passage, they'll beat their plows, their swords into plowshares, that sort of thing. They won't be fighting anymore when the Lord is upon the earth. There'll be that later war, battle, Gog and Magog, Satan getting the opponents of the Lord. But among the nations, there'll be no war once the Lord returns to the earth. They'll fight against him one more time, but there won't be war among the nations anymore. Last point, continue to trust that God has all things under control. Daniel chapter 4, if I just read a couple verses and we'll finish with these. And this is after God sent the Babylonians against Israel to conquer them, defeat them, wipe out Jerusalem, take captives, etc. Then he's teaching Nebuchadnezzar some lessons. But verse 17 of Daniel 4, this matter is by the decree of the watchers and the demand of the word of the holy ones, to the intent that the living may know that the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men, and giveth it to whomsoever he will, and setteth up over it the basest of men. That's a fascinating description of political leaders. The basest of men. Towards the end of that same chapter, verse 34, at the end of the days, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted up mine eyes unto heaven, and my understanding returned to me, and I blessed the Most High, and I praised and honored him that liveth forever, whose dominion is an everlasting dominion. His kingdom is from generation to generation, and all the inhabitants of the earth are reputed as nothing. And he doeth according to his will in the army of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth. And none can stay his hand or say unto him, what doest thou? We can question political leaders, but God is always in control. Never doubt that God has his hand on things. And whatever happens, Russia and Ukraine, we'll know more as the days go by. But think back to the 1940s when World War II was going on. Think back to World War I. What was the name of that war? The war to end all wars. So whoever came up with that was not very smart. There's always going to be wars. The Bible says, don't be troubled. God is in control, and Jesus Christ is coming again, and he'll put an end to war and bring peace. That's how to respond to what's going on in the world.